you, folks. And in fact, speaking of the Fayetteville Freethinkers, we are having a meeting tomorrow in the Fayetteville Public Library at 2 o'clock, and all of you are invited. We're going to have a special event tomorrow. We're going to be testing psychics tomorrow. We have been advertising that we will give out $10,000, and we have several tests here: a telekinesis test, a clairvoyance test, things like that. So, of course, why would we need to advertise that the psychics are real? Right? They should just know. So, anyway, we'll be doing that. That's 2 o'clock tomorrow in the Fayetteville Public Library. Okay, well, let's get started with today's talk. One of the most common questions I get as a outspoken and well-known atheist is how can you have morals, right? If God exists, then we can have morals, but if he doesn't exist, how could you do it? In fact, just a few years ago, I was on a coast-to-coast radio broadcast, and they talked to me for a bit and opened up the lines for questions, and 9 out of 10 questions, okay, it was the same question over and over. How do you get through ethics? How do you get through? And I'd explain to it, well, how does that work? So the whole show was basically about non-theistic ethics. So let's take a look at that. But first, I'm going to do two things today. First, I'm going to show you how ethics based on God doesn't work. Okay? Just that little task. We'll do that first. And then I will give you very briefly a summary of just a few of the non-God-based types of ethics out there. There's many. There's loads of them. There's dozens of them. Okay? So let's take a look first at, see if this works. Here we go, the divine command theory. That is the view that what makes an action right is that God commands it to be done. Okay? So if God says, do action X, okay, whatever X is, then that makes it right to do. And of course, conversely, if God says, don't do something, that makes it forbidden. Okay, so this is the most popular view of ethics around the world. Okay, I think everybody's familiar with approximately how this works. Okay, and people think, this is the appeal of this. Okay, is that people think, if I ever have a problem, I don't know what to do in a given situation. I just go home, open up the Bible, see the answer. Oh, I'm done. I know. Now I know what to do. That idea sounds very, very attractive. But let's take a look at some difficulties that this view has. First of all, let me remind you that there are many people who believe in God that are not divine command theorists, like this bishop here. In 1963, wrote a book, Honest to God, in which he said that ethics understood as following the will of this theistic God, revealed in such sacred sources as the Bible and the Ten Commandments, become nonsensical. That is the bishop saying this. Here's another bishop, Episcopal bishop. No divine and eternal law has ever been written either in the sky or on tablets of stone. Okay? These people are in church. They have a vested interest in pushing the view that ethics is based on God, but they don't. Why not? Why would somebody be in a church, be a bishop? In fact, when this fellow retired, he was the highest ranking bishop in the Episcopal Church. Why wouldn't he believe in the divine command theory? Let's take a look at some conceptual difficulties that the divine command theory has. Plato, 2,300 years ago, came up with one of the most devastating criticisms of the divine command theory. He was talking to this fellow in a dialogue, Socrates is talking to someone in this dialogue, written by Plato. Talking to a fellow named Euthyphro, who says he's going to prosecute his father for murder. And Socrates says, are you sure you want to do that, Euthyphro? Are you sure you want to, aren't you afraid that God's going to be angry? He says, oh, don't worry, Socrates, I know what the gods love and what they hate. The gods love what is holy, and they don't love what is unholy. And then Socrates asked one of the most important questions ever asked in the history of the field of ethics. Socrates asked, do the gods love what is holy because it is holy? Or is something holy because the gods love it? Now, this isn't the same question twice, okay? And everything depends on which of these two options you choose. Let me change the wording a bit of this question so you'll see a little better how it works, why it's so important. Instead of the word holy, we'll use right. Instead of the word love, we'll use command. So does God command an action to be done because it's right? Or is an action right because God commands it to be done? Okay. Now, if it's one way that God commands an action to be done because it's right, it's as if God is sitting there on, in that case, Mount Olympus or something, sees that an action is right. Oh, I see that the humanitarian is right. I'm going to tell people to do that. On the other hand, if it's this one, okay, then it's, you know what, I'm going to tell people to do something. What should I tell him to do when somebody says, give to charity? Okay, I'll tell him to give to charity. How about not give to charity? No, give to charity? No, don't give to charity. Okay, well, give to charity. Oh, now it's right. Okay, now it's right to do, because God commanded it to be done. Well, if an action, let's take the first side of that first, okay? If God commands an action to be done because it is right, then morality isn't dependent on God's commands, okay? Because God's commands, in fact, are dependent on morality. Right? If God is commanding an action on the grounds that it's right, then it was right before God commanded it. And the divine command theory is false, because the divine command theory says that God's commands constitute ethics. But if God's commands don't constitute ethics, but instead are based on ethics, then the divine command theory has things backwards. Okay? All right, you might say, okay, let's go with the other option. Let's say that God's commands do constitute ethics. Whatever God commands is going to be right. Okay, but that runs into a problem too. You see, if an action is right because God commands it to be done, then this leads to what's called the charge of arbitrariness. Why is it arbitrary? Well, because if God's commands create ethics, then God's commands can't be based on ethics. Right? If ethics comes after the commanding, then God's commands can't be based on ethics. And if they're not based on ethics, then they are morally arbitrary. In which case, we have no obligation to obey a morally arbitrary command. It could have been anything whatsoever. This happens to be this. Why shouldn't we obey that? Or if God says, okay, give to charity. Heads, you do it. Tails, you don't. Oh, I guess you do. Okay. Well, does that give us a reason to give to charity? Is that the nature of ethics? That seems absurd. But if God's commands are morally arbitrary, the divine command theory is in trouble. If God doesn't have morally defensible reasons for the commands, then so much the worse for the divine command theory. God is just shouting at us. Okay. Ignore it. It's noise. God doesn't have any good reasons. Right? So the dilemma looks like this. If God commands actions to be done because they're right, then the divine command theory is false. If actions are right because God commands them, then God's command is morally arbitrary. Either way, it looks very unpalatable for the proponent of God-based ethics. Now, they're not going to take this lying down. They're going to have some possible rebuttals. I've heard this one a number of times. It sometimes goes by the name essentialism. Evangelical Christians especially are fond of this. They say, well, God's commands are based on God's nature. Okay? God's nature is necessarily good. Okay? God has to have that particular nature, and it's a good nature. So it's not as if God is seeing something outside of himself to get ethics. It's something inside. But it couldn't be otherwise. It couldn't be arbitrary because it's God's nature, and it has to be the way it is. Okay, let's take a look at that response. Okay. First of all, this doesn't show that ethics is based on God. Even if it were true that God has a moral nature as part of his essential nature, this wouldn't show that God is the origin of morality any more than if I have humanity as part of my essential nature. That wouldn't mean that I'm the origin of humanity. So this is saying nothing about the origin of ethics. Also, if God did have morality as part of his essential nature, this wouldn't show anything about God being the standard of ethics any more than if I have humanity as part of my essential nature. That doesn't mean I'm the standard of humanity, right? So this essentialism stuff doesn't show anything toward what they want as their conclusion. In addition, we can point out, God has a nature? Really? How did that happen? Because usually we say something has a nature if that's the way it was made. Like a tiger is vicious by nature. Okay? That's the way tigers are. That's the way they're made. That's the way they are. They can't help it. If God has a nature, really? Who made God have that nature? Right? How did that happen? And you can't say, oh, well, it has to be that way because it's good, because then we can say, okay, why do you call it good? Typically, when we say somebody is good, we have a list of things. We say, oh, people who do these things are good people. That's why we call them good. We have a list of things. But if you're going to say, oh, God's nature is the standard of ethics, then you're saying, oh, God measures up to the standard. What's the standard? Himself. Oh, so God measures up to himself? Does that make any sense? I measure up to myself. I'm exactly myself. Right? If that's all you're saying about God, God is so good. Why? because he does exactly what is good. And what's good? Whatever he does from his nature. We'll just say, whatever his nature is, that's good. Okay, I can do that too. I'm going to define goodness as my nature. Now I am morally perfect, okay? Because I always do what my nature dictates. Right? See how easy that is. Okay, well obviously this doesn't make any sense. And if we ask, on what grounds do you call God's nature good? And you say, oh, because it's his nature, and whatever it is, we're going to call it good, that's circular. If you say, oh, it's based on some other standard of ethics, well then God isn't the standard after all. So you get the same Euthyphro dilemma about God's nature that you got with God's commands. It's the same problem. So this alleged rebuttal doesn't solve anything. It does absolutely zero toward solving the problem. Another problem with the divine command theory. If you believe, now there's a big if, especially in this crowd, okay? If you believe that ethics is immutable and eternal and can't be other than what it is, then you can't be a divine command theorist, because on the divine command theory, ECT, that says that ethics could have been otherwise if only God had decided to command something else. Okay? So if you believe ethics has to be the way it is, don't be a divine command theorist. And in fact, that's why many of those theologians are not divine command theorists. They don't like the charge of arbitrariness. Problem number 3, it's unworkable. Right? How do you put the divine command theory into practice, where you say ethics is constituted by God's command? Okay, first you got to have a God, because if you're going to say that ethics is divine command, you need a divine commander, right? And you got to know you got the right God. Otherwise, if you get the wrong one, well, you know, you're not getting the right command. And then, first of all, you got to sort through which commands are you going to say are the divine ones. And then, last but not least, you got to get the right interpretation. Wow, these are some pretty big hurdles, right? I mean, this is a pretty daunting task. If you're going to say, okay, I'm going to show you what the difference is between right and wrong. Really? Okay, first show me that there's a God. Well, historically, that's been very difficult to prove that God exists in Western philosophy. And I think I have some very good reasons in my book, What is Atheism? A Short Introduction, available wherever fine books are sold. I explain many of the reasons that these proofs that people have come up with over the centuries don't work. And then, again, you got to make sure you prove the right God. Because what if you're a good Christian and you want to prove that God exists? Get out pencil and paper, you're like, oh gosh, I accidentally proved the mind God exists. Oh, sorry. I guess you've been doing the wrong commands all this time. Okay. Oh, there's the question. And then, which commands are you going to say are divine ones? Now, this is really an interesting topic here, because, not that long ago in human history, the Middle Ages, tens of thousands, I've seen even some estimates upward of 1 million, had women, mostly women, were tortured to death, killed because they were suspected witches. Because it says in Exodus 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Right? People said, hey, it's a divine command, we gotta do it. Right? We gotta do it, we gotta kill the witches. Okay? But now, in the year 2012, if some Christian legislator here in Arkansas proposed a bill that we should kill witches, okay? Yeah. Oh, I've met some witches in Northern Arkansas. Okay, and they go around saying, I'm a witch, I am witchy, I have witchiness all over me, okay? And nobody's trying to kill them. Okay? So did this stop being a divine command? All of a sudden it had an expiration date? I don't think so.
I bet you there's people who are disgruntled because they can't go.
Yes, that's true, that's true. Yep. Deuteronomy 22 says if a man rapes an unbetrothed virgin woman, and is caught, he has to pay her father a fine of 50 shekels, marry her, and they can never divorce. That's his punishment. That looks like a divine command. It's pretty black and white in there, right? But if anybody tries proposing that as Arkansas law, you wouldn't get very far. Okay? So again, which are the divine commands? People used to think, yeah, these are divine commands. And at some point in human history, people said, hey, what about this? Is this a divine command? Don't take over these. Okay. Why do they ignore it? Here's another one. This comes to us from St. Paul. It says women shouldn't be allowed to teach. Really? If you're like me, I went through the Texas public school system. I don't say you can tell. Most of my teachers are women, and most of them were Christian. So how come they can teach? Well, that doesn't apply to us now. Really? Then why is it in my Bible? Right? Why are you telling us this? Why are we getting somebody else's letter if it's not for us? Here's a good one too. My friend Darrell, where's Darrell? He's doing something here. He found a tract that is being handed out here in Northwest Arkansas to this day by a fellow named Horace Dean, and he's very troubled about something he found in Deuteronomy, which says, "The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are an abomination to the Lord." Okay, so this Dean wrote a little pamphlet, and they handed it out around here, and it says, "Multitudes of our beloved Christian women are caught up in this fashion, don't realize they're transgressing one of the most fundamental of moral laws given by God." Really? Not only is it a divine command now, it's fundamental, right? You can't wear that which the opposite sex wears. Now, forgetting that back then men wore skirts. Oh, okay. We'll ignore that, right? But that means Hillary Clinton and Ellen DeGeneres are in serious trouble. Okay. Well, obviously, most Christian women ignore that. So is that a divine command or not? Right? That's totally up in the air. St. Paul also tells us women should not be silent in churches. They're not even allowed to speak. Really? There's lots of Christian churches with female pastors. Right? So obviously, some Christians believe we'll ignore that part. So what I'm trying to emphasize here, folks, is that this notion that, if you just adopt God-based ethics, you just pick up the Bible, you want an answer, you open it up, and you'll see the answer, right? No, it's not like that. It's not like that. You can see something in there, and someone else will tell you, ignore that. Oh, really? You gotta flip to the appendix and see that it says ignore this verse? No, we just decided, okay? It's gonna be, there's nothing more subjective than God-based ethics, because people say, you know what? I'm going to pray on this. I'm going to put my hands together, and I'm going to do whatever I feel that God wants me to do. Okay, so you just said you're going to do whatever you feel. Thank you. Okay, that's pretty subjective, right? And you can find all kinds of stuff in the Bible, from pacifism to warmongering, okay, from polygamy to celibacy, from one end to the other. So if really you're just going to pick out things based on how you feel, that's why we have over 2,500 denominations of Christianity just in the U.S. Speaking of which, let me give you one more example here, divorce. I like the example of divorce because it's so important to so many people. People love getting divorced almost as much as they love getting married. And it's very important, people, okay? So in Mark 10, the Pharisees come up to Jesus in this story, and they want to test him, it says. They want to see if he knows Mosaic law, and so they go up and say, "Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife?" In other words, is it allowed under the law, Jewish law, to divorce, for a man to divorce his wife? Jesus says, Moses said you could do it, but I say you can't. Right? He says, "But therefore God is joined together," God marries you, "let not man put asunder." So you can't break the bond that God creates. So they go up and ask him, "Can a man divorce his wife?" He says, "Moses said you could, but I say you can't." And in fact, further, if a man puts away his wife, divorces his wife, and marries somebody else, he's committing adultery, because you can't get divorced. You're still married. And if a woman does the same thing, she's committing adultery. And Luke 16:18 says the same thing. So twice we have that. Okay. Luke has the part just about the man. Okay, so that's why the Catholic Church says, we're not going to have divorces. Okay. On over to Matthew, right? We just saw Mark and Luke. Matthew says, same thing. They're going to test Jesus. They go up, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? And so on. Jesus says the exact same thing. Whosoever shall put away his wife, now I've underlined the special clause here, except it be for fornication, okay? And marries another, commits adultery. Everything else is the same, but he puts in this clause. So, if you're getting divorced because of fornication, whatever that is, okay? Greek word porneia, where we get the word porn, okay? If you're getting divorced because of that, then you can get divorced. For anything else, you can't really get divorced. Okay. So, you can get divorced then? Yeah, only for fornication, according to this guy. The other two Gospels said, no, you can't. And if that wasn't confusing enough, now Paul says in 1 Corinthians, and then the married, I command you, not I but the Lord. He says, this is the divine command. Let not the wife depart from her husband. The wife can't leave the husband, but if she does, she has to remain unmarried. But then there's, over in Romans 7, he says, if a woman leaves her husband, she's bound by the law to her husband, so long as he liveth. So once he's dead, right, then she can marry another man, and everything's fine. Okay, so a woman can divorce her husband. She's not supposed to, but she can. And she has to remain unmarried, unless she's dead. Okay? So we're getting all these little exceptions here. Not to mention what Deuteronomy 24, the laws of Moses, had already said. He's like, look, if a guy marries a woman and he finds some unfavor, he no longer finds favor in her, then he can write her a bill of divorcement, put it in her hand, send her out, she can go out and be somebody else's wife. Doesn't have to wait till he's dead, and they can get divorced. Easy. This is the one most denominations now prefer, because this is the one that most coincides with U.S. law. Okay. So can you get divorced? Well, the Bible's all over the place on that. Under what conditions? When? Can you? And then just in case you weren't confused enough, St. Paul says, you know what, this marriage thing, you shouldn't really get married anyway. Right? That takes care of the whole divorce business, doesn't it, right? 1 Corinthians 7, it's good for a man not to marry. Are you married? Don't seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Don't look for a wife. Don't try to get married, come on. Right? In fact, he says, if you're engaged to a woman, he says, he who marries a betrothed virgin does right, but he who doesn't marry her does even better. Well, you want to do the best thing, don't you? Don't you want to do the best thing? Okay, don't get married. Okay. Really? It says in the Bible not to get married? Yeah, well, it says that's the best thing. Interesting. All right, so can't even figure out where they're supposed to get married, let alone divorce. So people think, oh, if I have God-based ethics, I'm going to have all these objective moral standards and so on. No, you're not, because you have to be sorting through all of this different minutiae, all these contradictory statements and so on. And I'm just picking on the Bible, folks, because Christianity is the most prevalent religion in Northwest Arkansas and in the United States. We could do it with holy books of all kinds of other religions. Let me give you an analogy here. Suppose somebody says, oh, if you're going to build a bridge, don't use a ruler. You have to use the officially approved thing that we use, a Krueger, let's call it. Okay? What's a Krueger? Well, it's like a ruler, but it's a little bit different in size. Okay, really? All right, I guess I'll use a Krueger, because you have to. You cannot build a good bridge without the Krueger. Okay, well, give me one. Okay, well, here's one. This is the best one. Somebody says, no, don't use that one. Here's the other. Here's another one. Okay, I use this is now. It's a different religion. Somebody else says, no, I use this one. No, I use this one. And then you start looking at them and you see they're made of rubber, right? And they can be stretched pretty easily. So if you needed to stretch a little further, you can do that. And you say, well, wait a minute. There's different ones, different lengths, and even the ones you give me can change their own length. And they say, yeah, but you cannot build a bridge without one of these measuring things. Really? Okay. Would insisting on something like that kind of standard, really make any sense? Of course not. And then, of course, you can point to people and say, look, you know what? We built the bridge without using a ruler. We just used a regular, secular ruler that we made up, right? We made up this standard and we used it, and it worked fine, right? So, bye-bye, Krueger. Someone might say, can't we just pick and choose what we're going to use from the Bible? Can't we just, okay, yeah, it has all kinds of stuff in there we don't like, but can't we just pick and choose? Well, if you're going to pick and choose, what standard are you going to use for the picking and choosing? Because that's going to be subjective. Right? In other words, you have to use a principle, a standard for doing the choosing. And once you've done that, then the Bible isn't your standard, because you're using a moral standard to pick your morals. Okay? So, yeah, it's a vicious regress. Everybody wants to serve up some ethics. That's what that is. Wasn't that I was hungry or something? Okay. And of course, everyone's familiar with the Bible has all kinds of immoral commands in it, like, genocide, okay, things like that. Where God says, go and kill everything that breathes in that nation because I want to give you that land, okay, things like that. Or in this case, 1 Samuel 15, God says, oh, go kill everything that breathes, Joshua, go kill everything that breathes in that land. Why? Oh, because 400 years earlier, their ancestors attacked the Israelites as they left Egypt. Really? That would be like saying, hey, let's go kill everybody in Lowell, because 400 years ago, their ancestors attacked Columbus, when they got off the ship. Really? That's moral? That's morality here? Yeah, that's the Bible morality. I personally would use it. And most people in our society wouldn't like it either. The Bible, of course, sanctions slavery right here in Arkansas. It was appealed to more often than any other book to justify slavery. Okay, finally, the big problem that I have as a philosopher with the divine command theory is that it removes ethics from rational discussion. Okay? If someone is saying, look, God told me that this is what we do. Okay? I felt it in prayer. Really, we can't investigate that. It's just a question of, if you're a divine command theorist, did God tell you that or not? But we can't discuss, oh, let's see if we should obey that or whatever. If you're a divine command theorist, you got to do it. So the only question is, did you hear that from God or not? And there's no room for discussing the morality of that particular principle. So these are some really devastating problems with the divine command theory. And I think it pretty much sinks it. I think any one of these suggests that the divine command theory just doesn't work. And you see that in practice around our country and around the world. You see people with different ethics who use apparently the same book. Let me show you briefly a few moral theories. If you've taken an introduction to philosophy class or an introduction to ethics class, some of this will look very familiar. Here's a fellow, Immanuel Kant, who died in 1804. He is one of the greatest philosophers in the history of Western philosophy. He wrote a little work on ethics in which he says, among other things, it's impossible to conceive anything at all in the world, or even out of it, which can be taken as good without qualification, except a good will. What do you mean by good will? Good intention, your motive. He called it the maxim. The motive that you're using, that's how we tell whether an action is good. It's not by looking for any authorities, right? Authorities don't matter. What matters is, let's try to get what he calls logical consistency. He says, ethics is a set of categorical imperatives that you should do a certain action. Now, he believed that these were true eternally and absolutely because he believed that these were based on logic. And logic is eternal, and logic is applying to everyone. He said, by the way, even God is bound by ethics. Okay? So he believed in God, but he wasn't a divine command theorist at all. Well, how does this system work? Well, he says, look, here's how it works. You want to be fair. You want to treat other people as moral equals. So let's use this principle. He calls it the categorical imperative. That the way you tell whether an action is right is that it's logically possible that everyone could act on it. In other words, you're not singling yourself out for special treatment. Everybody could do the same thing. If you can imagine a world where everybody is acting on this principle and you don't encounter a contradiction, then you can act on that, whatever principle it is you want to use. Okay. But if you encounter a contradiction, that means that that's not fair. That's not allowing everyone to do it. That means you're trying to treat yourself differently. And that's not fair. Right? Now, actually, many people have compared this to the golden rule. Right? You're going to do others as you want them to act as well, right? To you. But this is a little different than the golden rule. But anyway, and of course, the golden rule didn't originate in the Bible, by the way. So here's how Kant has his test for how you put this moral theory into practice. Imagine what principle would allow you to perform the action. You universalize it, as he calls it. Imagine everybody can do it, and then see if it encounters a contradiction. If it does, you can't do it. If it doesn't, you can act on it. So, for example, let me give you an example here. Suppose that you're wondering whether you can steal. Okay? So, what maxim, what principle would allow you to steal? Well, presumably something like stealing is okay. So let's see if you could if everybody in the world could act on the principle stealing is okay. Right? First, universalize it. Imagine in your mind, in a thought experiment, everybody agrees that stealing is okay. Now, Kant says, you know what, we've already encountered a problem. Because if everybody says stealing is okay, if everybody agrees, oh yeah, you can take stuff without permission, well, that's actually giving tacit permission. right? If people are saying, yeah, you can take stuff whenever you see it, we all agree, you can just take stuff whenever you want. Well, then you can't steal, right? Because that's not stealing. If everybody says free stuff is everywhere, we all agree that it's impossible to steal stuff that's being given away, right? If you put an old dryer out in front of your house with a sign that says free, take it, and someone takes it, if you were to call the police and say, somebody stole my appliance, really? What did it look like? Well, it was large, white, and it had a sign that says free, take it. Right? They would hang up and say, that's not stealing, right? So he says that is a contradictory principle. Not everybody could act on it, so it wouldn't be fair for you to use it. What if you're wondering whether you could lie when you make a promise? Here's another example that Kant gives. Well, if everybody agreed that you could lie when you made a promise, then nobody would take promises anymore, right? Because you say, look, I want to borrow some money from this bank, and I will promise to pay it back. But the bank said, yeah, but we all agreed that it's okay to lie when you promise, so I'm not going to ask for your promise. Therefore, you can't lie when you make it. The institution of promise keeping disappears. So that encounters a contradiction, therefore you can't use it. So that's, there's of course a lot more to Kant's theory. I'm just giving you a very thumbnail kind of sketch here. But the basic idea is you can do all of this without any appeal to any divinity. Right? This is just something that many people find intuitively appealing, intuitively correct. Utilitarianism. This one is based on the greatest happiness principles. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. Wrong as they produce the reverse or unhappiness. Okay, so if you're going to perform an action, according to Jeremy Bentham, the originator, John Stuart Mill, the popularizer of this, you just ask yourself, who is going to be affected by this action? And then you just do whatever creates the most happiness. So what makes an action right is that it maximizes happiness for everyone affected by that action. And in fact, Jeremy Bentham said, if people started doing this, the world would be transformed. I mean, imagine how much better the world would be if people were trying to create happiness with their actions instead of, you look at the newspaper and it looks like, wow, there's a lot of people creating unhappiness here in this world. So you perform a calculation, in fact. Jeremy Bentham thought that this would literally make ethics into a science, okay? Because, for example, you're wondering whether you're going to be able to perform a certain action. First, identify who's going to be affected by that thing. Okay? Then calculate how happy would each one be, or how unhappy. Okay? Then you literally sum up, intuitively, whether it's going to create more happiness or not. And the different actions you could perform in that situation, whichever one creates the most happiness, or, if they're all kind of bad options, whichever creates the least unhappiness, you do that. Okay? Now, we all know how to do this, and in fact, we all pretty much do it in our daily lives all the time. Like if you have a friend that comes up and says, does this hat look all right on me? And let's say you think the hat looks pretty stupid, okay? You don't want to just say, that hat looks stupid. Instead, you might say, well, that would produce more unhappiness than maybe saying, I don't know if that's you. Or maybe you just want to go with what creates even more happiness. That is a great hat. That is a great, you have a boyfriend and girlfriend that comes up, what do you think of these new pants? Do these make you look good? They make you look great. Right? Okay, well, you're trying to create the most happiness, right? Excellent. So, in practice, let's say, by the way, Jeremy Bentham created this this unit of happiness called the Udall, okay? So you could quantify the happiness. Okay? He also created a unit of pleasure called the hedon, but we don't have to go into it. We'll just use rules. Okay? So let's put John, Sue, and Mary are sitting around wondering what action to perform on a given afternoon. Let's say they could, go to a movie or ride their bikes or whatever. And action one would produce 3 units of happiness for John, 3 Udalls. It would produce 3 each for Sue and Mary also, for a total of 9. Okay, but then now they look at the next option. Action 2 would produce 4 Udalls for John, but 2 each for Sue and Mary for a total of 8. So action 1 is more moral than action 2, according to Bentham. But the winner turns out to be action 3, because this one produces 2 utils for John, but 5 each for Sue and Mary. Right? They go see the romantic comedy. Right? And so it ends up producing 12 utils, and that's the winner. That's the one you do. Now notice that's the least amount for John, okay? But if John is a utilitarian, then he should agree to doing action 3 because that produces the most happiness. Right? And that's what you do. So if everybody went around producing as much happiness as they could, wow, we couldn't all help but be the beneficiaries of that. The total net happiness in the world would just increase. And then finally, let me give you one more secular ethics. There's, as I mentioned, scores of them. And if you take an ethics class at a college or university, take one here, 99.99% of the ethical theories you're going to study in class have nothing to do with God, okay? Because the God-based ethics is pretty much a dead end. You know, the said it or not, we can't discuss, okay? These, you can discuss things like with utilitarianism. Did that really create the greatest amount of happiness? Did I make a mistake? Does this, if I lie to my girlfriend all the time and tell her she always looks beautiful, is that going to come back and bite me in the back? Right? Because maybe she won't trust my judgment, you know? So you have to balance these things. You can discuss. You can be rational about ethics. This one, I like this one a lot. This one came out in the mid-70s. John Rawls, Harvard professor, said what makes an action right is that it's in accord with principles established by an ideal social contract. Now, if you take a social contract theory, that's a little bit different than what he's talking about. He's talking about an imaginary situation with ideal social contract makers that are going to make up the perfect rules, perfectly fair rules for society. You imagine what kind of rules they would have in that society, and then you do that. Okay? That will be your moral rules. So you imagine, again, the perfect society that's perfectly fair to everyone, and then imagine what they would be doing, and you do that to people you meet. Okay? Now, how do we figure out what kind of rules they would have? Well, he says, look, first imagine they're negotiating, they're getting together to what he calls the original position. They're going to make up the rules for society. But before they make up the rules, they don't know what status, what position in society they're going to have. So imagine it, here's my favorite analogy, like a role-playing game. Suppose you have a deck of cards with all the different roles in society that are going to be possible. And there's one for, you're a 3-month-old infant, you have chronic bronchitis, your family is, that you're born into is a middle-class family, and they don't have health insurance. You're a retired millionaire, you're white, you're a widower, and et cetera, et cetera. Here you're a single mother with 3 kids, et cetera. There's also things about your income, your gender preference, et cetera. Okay, so now you're going to make up the rules for society, and then they're going to shuffle the cards and deal one to you. Now, if you discriminate against anybody, if you're not fair, here's the thought experiment part. If you're not fair, then you run the risk that you're going to get the role that you discriminated against. Like if you say, oh, we're not going to let women drive, like in some countries. We're not going to let women drive. Then you get the woman card. Oh, I just screwed myself. You're not going to discriminate if you don't know what role you're going to have in society. Right? You say, oh, we're not going to have gay marriage, but then you get the gay card. Oh. Okay, well, that's why you're going to gravitate toward fairness. So Rawls says, if people were to engage in this thought experiment and imagine those kind of rules, they would tend to gravitate toward these principles: equal liberty, equal opportunity, and then something called the difference principle, where some people are doing a lot better than others, you kind of help out the less fortunate, right? You give to charity and so forth and so on. And again, there's a lot more to this theory. I'm just giving you a thumbnail sketch, but this is something that people can rationally discuss. They can discuss the best implementation of these kinds of things. It brings ethics into the realm of human activity. Because sometimes people say, oh, well, you know, if you adopt these secular ethics, though, these things aren't true ultimately. I don't even know what the difference is between something being true and something being true ultimately. I don't know. Seems like it must be good enough if it's true. But if someone says, these things are only true because human beings accept them as true, isn't it just a human invention? Well, I like to give people this analogy. Suppose you're playing chess, okay? The queen is the most powerful piece. But what if someone goes up while you're playing chess and says, ah, off the board, that queen doesn't mean anything? You probably look at that person and say, what are you, an idiot? Get away. You know, we're playing chess, right? You don't need the queen to mean anything off the board. Similarly, we don't need ethics to mean anything outside of our own human activities. That's where we need to apply ethics, to our own human activities. And if it means something there, that's good enough. We don't need it to mean something ultimately. Okay, so summary, God-based ethics sucks, secular ones are good. By the way, I always like to issue this challenge. If somebody doubts that that secular ethics can work, if somebody thinks that, oh, you need things to be meaningful ultimately, okay, let me see if I can get this. And something that's just a human invention doesn't matter, okay? Well, I always like to pull out a dollar bill and I tell the person, okay, if you think things have to mean something ultimately to be meaningful, then you get out a 20, I'll get out my 1 and we'll trade, okay? And I'll do this all day long with my 1s and your 20s. Because if you think, well, money doesn't mean anything ultimately, it's just a human invention, fine, let's trade. But they don't do it with me. They don't trade with me because they know, yeah, we don't need money to be valuable ultimately. We just need it to be valuable for what we use it for. Thank you.